Thank you for listening to me now. I hope you will enjoy this presentation, which will be quite visual. So I will be also showing quite a few images, reproductions and pictures to sustain my arguments. This presentation focuses on two very different kinds of magic, as the catchy quote from Freddie Mercury shows in the title. The first one, associated with high culture and feeding on literature, architecture, and the arts, evokes the imaginary of Prague being one of the European capitals of esotericism, alchemy, and magic. The second one, associated with popular culture instead, is the fertility magic of seasonal Masopust door-to-door processions, which characterize many rural Czech localities. The first kind has been popularized in post-socialist times and transformed into a portion of the capital's many attractions in order to meet the growing demand of mass tourism that you all know very well here. And the latter has never ceased instead to be a popular phenomenon, actually becoming the second Czech item to be inscribed in the UNESCO list of Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2010, thus entering the international arena of cultural tourism. Both phenomena, or rather clusters of phenomena, are of course elements of Czech history, but they also form part of what has been called the heritage memory identity complex, hyphenated, heritage-memory-identity complex, which is, in turn, along with history, a substantial component in the expression and ongoing rearticulation of the Czech nation and nationhood after the watershed years of 1989, 1993, and 2004. The genealogy of the widely diffused circulation of the trope of the magicness of Prague is mostly a modern phenomenon, although the practices associated with these are obviously not modern, but mostly medieval and early modern. Such construction is mostly, as said, a high culture phenomenon, especially a literary one. It could be interesting to dwell on a brief anthology of the most significant examples of this genealogy. So I'm going to quote these excerpts and citations, source citations from this ideal literary and high culture genealogy. So in 1893, Czech novelist Vilém Mštík described in his novel Santa Lucia Prague as a černá krása, and as a černou zvůdnici, skrytou v negliže bílých blstavých mlh. A black beauty, a black seductress, shrouded in the negligee of the white mists of the Vltava. Arnošt Procházka, in his book Rozhovory s knihami, obrazy i lidmi, published in 1913, notes how vždy znova a znova obluzuje svými čáry stará čarodějka Praha. In the 1930s, Nesval, in his Pražský chodec, compares Prague's tower to a zhromaždění černokněžníků, a gathering of necromancers. As for the German-speaking authors, apart from the well-known characterization of Prague in Meyring's novels, that we all know very well here, and in his illustrator Hugo Steiner, of course, Oskar Wiener could be mentioned, who in his Deutsche Dichter aus Prag, 1919, writes about Prague, die Stadt der Sonderlinge und Phantasten, die ruhelose Herz von Mitteleuropa, the city of eccentrics and visionaries, the restless heart of Central Europe. Robert Musil, in turn, was convinced that Prague was the Mittelpunkt Europas, wo die alten Weltachsen sich schneiden, the central point of Europe, there where the ancient axes of the world intersect. In the same period, Kafka famously declared about Prague that dieses Müschen hat Krallen, this little mother has claws. whereas a few years later, André Breton crowned Prague as la capitale magique de la vieille Europe, the magical capital of old Europe. The fame of Prague as the magical city reached its peak in the early 70s of the last century, actually, with the publication of Praga Magická by the Italian Slavist Ripellino. Here I've chosen this cover from a French edition because of this very interesting subtitle, at the heart of a grand cultural myth, which describes very well, in my opinion, what this idea of Praga Magická, of Magic Prague, has become in the time. Ripellino's book was not a study in historiography, but rather a blend of what we would nowadays call cultural studies, comparative literature, and fiction. Ripellino was explicitly in the search of the metaphysics of Prague, or rather the metaphysical ingredients forming Pragueness, as he openly wrote. Unlike anthropologists and social scientists busy in deconstructing and de-essentializing cultural representations and narratives, Ripellino's intention was to consciously essentialize Prague as much as possible, to squeeze out the cultural juice it was made of, and in so doing creating an entire imaginary and actually a cultural myth, as we saw before. This operation was at least partly successful. It is difficult to measure the impact of this work, also because it's a controversial legacy. It is indeed a book that has had a controversial legacy. What is sure is that the volume has been widely read and has enjoyed many translations, as well as many Czech editions and reprints, which have consolidated the fame of the book, as well as the fame of Prague, as the magical city amongst the learned Czechoslovaks, Czechs, and Europeans more in general. With the time, this characterization of Prague overpowered into other domains and started circulating more widely from the level of high culture into mass culture as well. From being a fictional myth, Magic Prague became a self-feeding myth. With the divorce between Slovakia and Czechia, the economic and political transition to liberal democracy, and the EU Europeanization of the young Czech state, its magical hlavní město started attracting mass tourism, and circulation of these cultural tropes started involving not only different social cultural layers of the local societies, but also the visitors and tourists, along with all the other social actors involved in this process: tour guides, experts and state functionaries, cultural entrepreneurs, ethnographers, of course, etc. Far from being only the results of obscure alchemists, decadent writers, and eccentric emperors, the magicness of Prague became a major ingredient of its economic success and international visibility, and consequently even a matter of national pride and national identity. In 2019, Prague was for the first time ranked in many rankings globally as the 4th most visited city in Europe, for the first time taking over Barcelona and immediately after Rome, Paris, and London. Before moving to our Masopust, I will conclude this section about Prague with a mention to yet another example of intersection between national identity this time, religious history, and affiliation, as well as cultural heritage and tourism. Here we can probably agree on the fact that Staročeské náměstí is one of the most important places in the city, and therefore in the country. It is what the anthropologist Bernardino Palumbo would name a hyperlieu, hyperlieu that stands in counterbalance with Marc Augier's notion of non-lieu, the non-place, the non-space. It could also be conceptualized with a notion developed by Pierre Nora as a lieu de mémoire, there where collective and national memories agglutinate within and around special hotspots characterized by a thick historical and symbolic stratification, such as this square precisely. In this case, such a stratification can be perfectly exemplified by the coexistence of three extremely thick symbols that bear national, political, religious, and generally historical significance. The astronomical clock, embodying Prague's deep past and fascination for astrology and alchemy. The statue of Jan Hus, not only a religious and scholarly figure, but also one of the fathers of the Czech nation. And finally, yet as importantly, the Mariánský slope, representing instead, on the one hand, the controversial Catholic legacy in Bohemia, and on the other, exemplifying current political and religious polarization, and the cultural battles for the interpretation of history and its significance, in a very Czech declension of the war of statues we have been seeing happening in these very last months. The adjective Staročeský already evokes a profound linkage between time, the territory, and the people. As anthropologist Francesco Baeta has written, in marginal contexts, the antiquity of the festival is a very important element. Why does an ancient festival function more efficiently in the construction and in the maintenance of the local identity? Because the stretching of the temporal depth of the festival means the widening of its symbolic density and stratification. In other words, the older the phenomenon, the more typical, original, and authentic it is perceived. And this is quite interestingly embodied in the adjective Staročeský, which is not very common in other languages, to have these compound sorts of forms of adjectives that unite this prefix of staro, something old or ancient, along with a national definer or an ethnonym, whatever else. Such antiquity, along with the other formal features of the traditional masks and the dances, made it possible for the Masopust to be recognized, as already said, in 2010 in the UNESCO list. Magic is actually at the center of the Masopust of the Hlinecko area. The emic words expressing this characterization are plodnost and štěstí, which indeed occurred often during my ethnography there. For instance, here you can see the ethnographer at work. For instance, štěstí, just like bonheur in French and Glück in German, can mean both happiness and luck, or rather good fortune. And it is in this respect that it is used in the context of Masopust, which is supposed to bring, in a magical way, fertility and good fortune. This aspect is so relevant in the general local understanding and religious economy of the festival that it has been itself been heritagized, becoming an official feature of the tradition, of the local tradition. This is a citation from the official UNESCO document. The UNESCO, along with the Czech Ministry of Culture, a variety of functionaries and local stakeholders, have been active agents in several dynamics involved in this process, variously contributing during the transition to transform these elements of local folk traditions, in fact quite ignored or even despised until not so long ago, into a matter of national heritage, cultural prestige, and global tourism. As is well known, Masopust, the Slavic carnival, is connected with the liturgical calendar of the church, and it is therefore intrinsically connected, at least historically, with the religious life of the communities practicing it. Furthermore, in Czechia as elsewhere, it shows evident elements of popular magic. In this respect, even though in a very different way than Prague high magic, which has, however, also been popularized in the last few decades, it also shows an interesting form of entanglement between religiosity, rituality, spirituality, local and national identity, and cultural heritage, under the sign of a specific form of folk magic, indeed a very different type of magic. Thank you for your attention.